Did you ever need to automatically process your database records depending on the events that are happening to the database? So stay tuned, because today we'll be seeing database triggers. So, a database trigger is essentially a piece of code that runs automatically every time an event happens to the database, and we have multiple triggers for multiple events. But one thing you should keep in mind when dealing with triggers is that it's processed in a per record basis. So if you have multiple records, every single record will call the trigger once. This means that the code you write for triggers must be as efficient as possible, because if it's not very efficient, it will lead to performance issues. So it's very common for users to try to add as much complexity as possible in a trigger and end up with a slow responding app. It's also very common for users to use NPM modules, and by the way, you can use NPM modules when working with triggers, but try to make it as essential and as efficient as possible. Try not to consume external data, do external requests. Remember, it must be as efficient as possible so your app can be as fast as possible. And as I said, we have multiple triggers, and the first one we're going to see today is save triggers. So here in my Visual Studio, I have the two triggers that we have for saving: the beforeSave and afterSave. BeforeSave, as the name states, is run before the record is actually written to the database. So you can manipulate data as much as you want, and at the very end it will be written to the database, or you can return an error instead if you don't want to write that record. So in this case here, I have a class named Review, and I have a property named comment, where I'm going to trim this property to 136 characters. So I'm getting only the substring of 0 to 137 and complementing it with appending a 3 dots at the very end. So this code will execute as soon as the request comes to the server. We'll change the comment property to this value here, so it will crop it and then add 3 dots at the very end, and only then it will be saved. I could, for instance, reject this and not save it at all if I want to. It's very useful if you want to keep your database sanitized and not even write the record that you know that's not fulfilling your database rules in there. The second one is the afterSave. The afterSave runs right after the database is written with your record. So it's usually very useful when you have some processing that must, for instance, check other classes and have a more heavy processing of the record after it's actually written. In this case, I have a afterSave for the comment class that will make a query inside the post class and try to increment the comments for that post. So every time you have the database already written and want to process the record after, you should use a afterSave. The next one is the afterDelete, and it's the only trigger that we have for delete. So this is very useful, for instance, when you have a record and you have sub-records of it in another class, let's say pointers or maybe relations, and you want to keep a clean database, so when you delete the father record, all the child records will be deleted as well. And this is exactly what's going to do here. It's going to check after delete the post class, so every time I delete a record in the post class, it will go into the comment class and destroy all objects related to that one post in there. So this is very good for keep your database sanitized, so you will never end up with a child record that does not have a parent record. Now, we also have triggers for files, but it's important to know that when you upload a file to Befor, you actually end up with two processes. The first one is uploading the actual file, the content of the file, to our servers, and then relating that file inside the database. The uploading part is not covered by the triggers. Every time you upload a file, it will just upload it, and all these triggers will run on the database portion of this process. So beforeSaveFile, as the name states, will run every time before the file is written to the database. Notice the actual file is already saved in your bucket, but the link for it inside your database is not. So before this link is actually written to the database, you can write some code here and it will execute for that. In this case here, I'm just creating a new file with some content as text and then returning this new file instead. So it will end up replacing the file I just uploaded and saving this text one. afterSaveFile, it runs after the file is actually uploaded and after the link is written to the database. So in this case, I'm looking for the original file inside the file object class, and I'm going to write some properties for it. So I want to record the file size and created by some user. You can change as much as you want, but it's important to understand that the upload process is always going to happen, and at the very end, after this link for this file is written in the database, it will run the afterSaveFile. You can also delete files. So beforeDelete will run before it deletes the link from the database and before it deletes the actual file. We first delete the link and then we delete the file. And this will run right before deleting the link. So in this case here, I'm making a query looking for inside my file object class, looking for a file name specifically that I sent inside the request. And for that one, I'm going to look for the very first record that I find. And if that is not from the same user, I will not let it be deleted. So this is just a sample logics, but you can change it as much as you want to meet your business needs. But the important part here is to know that this will happen before you do anything. So for instance, if you write some code here to jump out of this method without deleting the file, it will happen before the link is deleted on the database and before the file is deleted on the bucket. And afterDeleteFile, this will run after the link is deleted, but not the file from the bucket. So the file will still be in the bucket, but you do not have the link for it inside the database. In this case here, I'm looking for a class named file object, where I'm going to look for the file name that I passed here on the request. I'm going to find the first record that matches this query and then destroy it using the afterDelete. Once again, you can change this logic to meet your business needs, but it's important to understand that this will run after the link is deleted from the database, but before the file is actually deleted from the bucket. We also have before and after find methods. Every time you run a query, the query is processed by our database, and you can design your application to respond how it will execute and find those objects with those triggers. beforeFind will run before it tries to actually find the objects, before actually trying to run your query. So if you need to set some parameters or perhaps changing some parameters to ensure your query runs in a consistent way, it should be done beforeFind. So it will change your query before it's executed from the database and then execute it. afterFind is more useful when you have a subset of data that already has run in the database. So you already have the data retrieved from the database, but before it's actually delivered to your end user, let's say the SDK or a REST API call or a GraphQL call. So all this data is in memory and you can change it as much as you want before delivering it to the end customer. Sometimes you have to control the login process. As you probably know by this point, Parse has the user class that allows you to create and manage users for your application. And sometimes you have to change the login process, for instance, to check if that user can actually log in or not. And sometimes you have to run some logic to check what to do after the user logged out. So beforeLogin will run before the actual server responds to the client telling that the user has access. In this case here, I'm getting the user from the request and checking a property called isBand, which is probably a boolean in this example. But if isBand is true, by the way, isBand is not a regular a default property of the application. This has to be created by you. And if the isBand is true, which is the case here, you get this new error, access denied, you have been banned. So it will not allow you to proceed. Even if the username and password is correct, you end up not being logged on, so you will not be able to retrieve any data that requires you to be logged on. And sometimes you want to check and execute some logic after the user has logged out. In this case, I have another property called isOnline that is also a boolean and is also not default by the application, so you have to create it yourself. And what I'm going to do is, after the user logs out, which means after he clicks the logout button and sends the logout request and gets a response, after all this process succeeds, this property will be set to false. So once again, you can change this logic to meet your business needs, but it's important to understand that this will run automatically at the very end of the logout process. Last but not least, we have the live query triggers. Live query triggers are run every time a live query event happens. The first one is beforeConnect. Every time you try to connect to the live query server, it will run this piece of code, so you can check if everything is all right and then make some business decisions. In this case, I don't want to let any user that's not logged on to have access to live queries. So if I don't pass the user in the request, I will just throw an error. Please log in before you attempt to connect. This will enforce my user has to be logged on, and then it will allow live query access to it. So before subscribe, it will run every time you try to subscribe to a class. Live queries work with subscription, so you have multiple classes inside your applications, and you need to subscribe to the ones you want to use live query. And every time that you want to subscribe, before it actually subscribes, it will run this piece of code here. You have to pass the class name up here. And in this example, I'm checking if the admin property is true, which is a boolean and is also not a regular property, a default property of the application. You have to create it yourself. So if I'm not an admin, you'll get a "you're not authorized to subscribe to this class." And if it is an admin, it will jump this if and end up here, end up by allowing the user to subscribe. So this is very useful when you try, for instance, to filter which users can and cannot subscribe to every single class. You can have multiple classes and the user can only subscribe to the ones that they actually have access to. AfterLiveQueryEvent will run after the subscription is done, and you can have multiple actions. So every single event that happens, it doesn't matter which event happens, this code will run. In this example here, I'm setting the name as 3 asterisks, and I'm setting the original request to the name YOLO. The thing here is you can use the events that come to filter to which ones you want your code to apply. We have a detailed list of possible events in the official documentation that you can check, but the main part here that you have to understand is this will run for every single event. This code must be very, very efficient, because for every single event inside a live query subscription will be run through this code. So keep that in mind, and then you can filter for the events that you want to execute. And last but not least, onLiveQueryEvent. This, once again, can support multiple events. You have to check. In this example, I'm checking if the event is not disconnect, which means I'm not disconnecting, it will just return. What else? If not, then else I can run my logic here. Ideally, you should filter for the only events that you need to run your code, because if you don't, you might end up running in a situation where you did not predict that that a specific event would run and then have a bad situation. So ideally, you should probably list only the events that you want to serve and change code, and then deploying only for that. Well, after you finish doing this, all you have to do to upload your cloud code is save this file. I'm going to save it here on my desktop with the name main.js. Click Save. Go back to my parse dashboard, click on the cloud and click Upload File. Choose my main.js file here, just open. It will ask if I want to override because I already have a example one in there, so yes, overwrite it. And finally click Deploy. Got it? I can click it, see if my code is correct inside, it seems to be. And now all the code here will be executed every time a record runs inside the review or in the comment classes. So if you found this video useful, I hope you click the like button, and I hope you subscribe to this channel so you can see other videos like this. See you soon. Bye bye.